Robin Zander, scene A1.
Hello and welcome back to Snafu with Robin Zander. I'm Robin Zander, and today my guest is author and TED speaker Simone Stolzoff. Simone is on stage. He's actually the opening act at Responsive Conference 2025 this September 17th and 18th. And in this podcast, we talk about what it means to be a writer in the age of AI and how he is using AI in his writing process. His first book, The Good Enough Job, and his next book, How to Not Know. I really enjoyed talking about uncertainty in the 21st century, the role of work, and much more with Simone. And if you want more from Simone, you should come see him live at Responsive Conference 2025. Now, into the interview. All right, Simone, thank you for sitting down for a podcast today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
I'm so excited for you to come on stage at Responsive Conference this September. And what's really fun as we've gotten to know each other just a little bit throughout 2025 is the number of overlapping places, right? People in common, ecosystems in common, which doesn't surprise me. We both, talk about and think a lot about the future of work. But the introduction came from a completely unexpected source, which is somebody that we know. I'll call him out because as a professional musician, I'm sure he doesn't mind. McGilvery Allen, dear friend of both of ours, grew up in my hometown. And one of the things you've talked a lot about is diversifying your identities. And so I'm curious, as somebody who I've thought a lot about identity in ways I'll share in a minute, but what are some of the identities you hold that are not the things you're known for? TED speaker, best-selling book author, writer, journalist, etc.
Yeah, I've gotten this question a fair amount because I encourage other people to ask it, like, what do you like to do as opposed to what do you do, or what other identities do you hold beyond your LinkedIn title? And I've yet to come up with a very succinct response, but some of the other ones are, I'm an ultimate Frisbee player. I've played competitive ultimate Frisbee for the entirety of my adult life. I am an aspiring salsa dancer. My wife and I are taking sort of intro to salsa classes. I am a former spoken word poet. My path into writing was through spoken word poetry, and it's sort of a skin I've shed at this point in my professional life, but it was the most important thing to me when I was 19 years old. And I'm a new father. I have a 5-month-old kid, so I'm adjusting to that new identity as we speak.
Yes. Trying to get caught up on sleep is a consistent effort in those first couple of years, as I understand it. In your TED Talk, you talk about this beautiful idea of Shabbat in the Jewish tradition as a time sanctuary. And we, Zander Media, my day job, just finished some filming for the Jewish community centers in Boulder and Denver, actually just last week. And I was really struck by, I grew up, I'm not Jewish culturally or religiously, but I grew up around a lot of communities that were and partook in Shabbat quite a bit in my childhood. And I'm really struck by that inside or outside of the Jewish tradition as like taking time for community. I'm wondering if you can speak to that and maybe tell that story a little bit as you told it on stage at TED.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two ideas that I really like about Shabbat. The first is sacred time, which is carving out one day of the week where work is not an option, where you're supposed to be spending time with your family and with those that you love, and time kind of slows down. You're not supposed to be on your devices or your screens. And as sort of a reformed progressive Jew, I don't adhere to all of the strict guidelines, but this idea of this separation between the work week and Shabbat, I've always found as a really nice barometer for time. And the second idea, which I really like, comes from this rabbi. And the idea is basically that Shabbat is like a sanctuary in time. So similar to a synagogue or a church or a mosque being a physical sanctuary, Shabbat too is a sanctuary that requires infrastructure to protect it. And so how I relate this to work is that I think a lot of times we have intentions to do things like set better boundaries or to practice self-care or to work less. And I think what actually leads to balance, what actually leads to our ability to invest in aspects of who we are beyond work, are structural barriers. So, not being able to check your email, not being able to scroll down and think about what you might have been thinking about during the day, during dinner, because the phone is in another room, or you're on a walk with your best friend, or you have this clear structural protection against your ability to let work seep into your mind. And my colleague and a friend, Ann Howland Peterson, has this really great distinction between boundaries and guardrails. So if you think about a road, the boundaries are sort of the lines that supposedly keep you from going from one lane into the
Hopefully.
other. And the guardrails are, the metal railing, the infrastructure that prevents you from going off the road. And what I always tell people is we really need more guardrails than boundaries. The problem with individually imposed boundaries is often they break down, or inevitably they break down, when the pressures of capitalism or your anxiety about the Sunday scaries sort of creep into your mind. And so what I think actually helps people invest in their lives outside of work is to create those structural protections, to go to that yoga class where you're not able to check your email, to put your phone in airplane mode when you're playing with your kid, so you're not tempted to always sort of reach back into that other identity.
Drill into the Judaism piece just a little bit if you're game, because particularly having just spent some time in these very robust community centers, one of the things that I see increasingly in the world today is a hunger for in-person gathering and
Mm.
for these inherent structures in community where people can meet each other, where people can gather, where grief is not something that societally or organizationally we're well organized as a society to support, but various cultural groups and religious groups are much better at handling these. So what impact, and I really don't know, has Judaism played in your life, particularly in shaping these you're thinking about work-life boundaries, for example, or how you structure your life and your work?
First thing that came to mind was that religion is sort of like a container. And within that container, there's a certain value system. You might have, in sort of tech parlance, different metrics that matter than, for example, whether your growth chart is going up and to the right. And, my first book was about work and identity. My second book is about uncertainty. And I think religion is a very interesting bridge between the two. For the first, I trace how the decline of things like organized religion or neighborhood and community groups left this void where people were looking for identity and community and a sense of purpose and a means of self-actualization. And yet, without those institutions that once provided it in so many people's lives, they turn to where they spend the majority of their time, which is the office. The second book is about uncertainty and how to get better at dealing with what we don't know. And one of the main points that I make in that book is that one of the best ways to deal with uncertainty is to find your anchors, find the things that you are certain about. And I think religion provides that in a few ways. One, it can be an anchor of ritual. So there are practices that you go by. For example, in the Jewish tradition, when you lose someone that you love, there are very clear operating instructions for how you sit Shiva. And so you might be thinking, oh my gosh, there's so much uncertainty, so much unknown. I don't know how I'll live without them. And it can be really refreshing to say, okay, on day 1, you do this. On day 2, you do this. On day 7, you take a walk in your neighborhood and show your face. And then the second thing is that, a religious community is a way to find a community of people who couldn't care less about what you do for work. They have a different value system, in the same way that my pickup basketball game that I play in each week doesn't care about how many words I've written or how many books I've sold. A religious community or an organization, it doesn't necessarily have to be religious, is a great source of contrast to the value system that exists within the workplace. And so I just have sort of refound my connection to religion and to Judaism in my mid 30s. I think I had a pretty typical path where I started sort of going out of obligation growing up. In my 20s, I sort of pushed it away. I wanted to individuate. And now, as I have my own family and as I'm looking for sources of community and meaning outside of work, I've rediscovered some of the beauty that comes with this ritualistic wisdom that has been passed down from generation to generation.
Yeah, very interesting, very cool. Um, one of my theories of the next, I don't know, 50 years is I think that we're going to see just this growing exponential fracturing or mm, spiraling out of lots of new religious and spiritual practices as AI, as technology, as screens continue to be sort of the defining point by which we all relate to each other for people to gather in person. And so,
Mm.
whether that is pre-existing religious practices and communities or new ones, I see a hunger. I don't generally tend to predict things. Like I don't on stage at Responsive Conference, we have, futurists and people who make predictions about the future. I don't tend to. And I kind of see it as inevitable that religion is going to be a bigger part in society in the next 50 years. I don't see that it could not be.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree, especially with the sort of existential threat that AI poses to one of our primary sources of meaning and identity, which is, work. I wonder where people will find those sort of base psychological needs, the need to feel seen, the need to be in community, the need to live for something larger than themselves. And whether it is the organized religions that we know and love, or it is some other sort of instantiation of a spiritual practice, I do believe there is inevitability in their growth. But the data actually is pointed in the opposite direction. So if you look at, say, the 1950s, which was the peak of religiosity here in the United States, it was about 3 or 4% of people weren't associated with religion. So there's this psychological or the
Hmm.
social science term called the nones, Nones, that refers to people that are either agnostic or atheist or just don't associate with anything in particular. And so in the 50s, it was about 3 or 4%. And now it's almost 1 in 3. So you've seen this
Wow.
precipitous decline in people
Interesting.
affiliating with religious identity. And there's a myriad reasons for why that happens. Part of it is as countries or individuals get more wealthy, they tend to become more secular. Part of it is the rise of the internet, where people who might have not otherwise found community in their doubts now can find people who they feel more confident walking away from religion. Part of it is the association of particularly right wing politics and Christianity here in the United States and how that has grown over time. But I do believe that there still is this fundamental need to find meaning, to find purpose, to find ritual. And so I'm excited to see what form that will take, even if it is not the forms that we're used to in the past.
Kind of an unrelated, but it's just one of the almost defining times in my life was 2016 when I opened up Robin's Cafe in April of 2016 and started Responsive Conference, which was between February and September of 2016. The day I first walked into the shop that became Robin's Cafe, the restaurateur who was selling the assets showed up with a big long list and told me, let me know what you want to buy and I'll get rid of the rest. But in the theater in the Mission that became what is now Robin's Cafe was um, one of these sort of very young, very hip Christian groups that was just sort of coming up in the Mission in that time. I don't remember the name of the group specifically, but very young, 20s, very diverse. There was a rock band playing on the main stage. And I remember walking in and it was like, oh, wow, this is a religious group, a church, literally a church that is renting out this theater that I was going to use for my own event. And the cafe was going to be in the same building. And it was the first time I'd ever walked into like, felt like revival meeting in the South, except it was full of people my age and younger who were there partying, right? Just
Mm,
on a Saturday morning. And it happened to have religious organization rather than just people having a party.
that's
Um,
cool.
yeah, it was certainly interesting. It was a very unusual moment to start the idea that became Robin's Cafe. The other thought that I had is as you were describing the multiple identities, and it's kind of just a throwback, but I first heard the idea or maybe embraced the idea of don't define myself exclusively by my work, right? I've been an entrepreneur now for more than 15 years. Reading the 4 Hour Work Week, so way back in 2009, probably, because Tim Ferriss was saying, okay, if you're working on your business, your muse or your project or your day job or whatever it is, what is it that you're doing that you can go do something else and feel really good about your progress, even if you've had a bad day selling tickets to Responsive Conference or, employees at Zander Media or whatever, hassle I'm dealing with, whatever fire I'm putting out. And so, having just come back from the gym an hour ago, movement has always been mine there, where it's like, no matter what else is going on in my life, I'm working out every single day because it's always been a source of solace and joy for me. And having at least those two, and obviously the goal is many, many more things that keep us ourselves. But it's fun to, all these decades later, hear the same echo of it's not prescriptive how much you work, right? So your quote that you gave in the TED Talk, some people do what they love for work. Others work so that they can do what they love when they're not working. Neither is more noble, right? If you want to speak to your relationship with the poet, is it Anis Mojgani?
Yeah, Anis Mojgani. Yeah. The punchline first, but I also appreciate that as a way into thinking about how my ideas around work were shaped. And so the story that you mentioned was from when I was a senior in college. I was studying poetry and economics. And so you can already see a bit of a existential crisis looming on the horizon. And so I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do after school. And I had the chance to interview my favorite writer in the world, who's this poet named Anis Mojgani. And so I asked him, Anis, how do you feel about the mantra, do what you love and never work a day in your life? And I was expecting him to give me a pep talk. Here I was, a poetry major. I wanted him to say, go follow your passion, kid, and the money will follow, and the world needs more poets. And he didn't. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, what you just quoted, some people do what they love for work, others do what they have to, so they can do what they love when they're not working. And neither is more noble. And I think that last part is really key. We live in a society that loves to revere people whose jobs and identities neatly align. And here was my idol, a professional poet, no less, telling me that, okay, it's okay to have a day job. And I think it points to the point that you brought up earlier about the value of going to the gym. I think there's sort of the business case and there's the moral case to be made. The business case is that, if you're working hour 13 of a 14-hour day, or if you've worked for 6 months in a row without taking any time off, you're not going to be firing at all cylinders. To be able to produce at a high volume sustainably over time requires rest. Rest is not sort of the opposite of work, but an integral part of being able to perform at your best. The research backs this up. It shows that people who have greater self-complexity, who have invested in more sides of themselves, tend to be more innovative, tend to be more creative problem solvers, tend to be more resilient in the face of adversity. If you are rising and falling just on your professional accomplishments alone, and your boss says something discouraging, it can spill over into all facets of your life unless you have other identities that you're holding. But I think there's also the moral case to be made, which is that when we consider ourselves more than just workers, we become more well-rounded. We invest in other parts of who we are. It allows us to see ourselves as part of a community and part of a society. And it allows ourselves to invest in things that are not means to another end, but ends in and of themselves. There's a huge risk in defining yourself just based on one thing, whether it is your work or your hobby or even your religious identity, which is that it can be incredibly brittle. It's like balancing a very narrow platform, and you're susceptible to a large gust of wind. I think we saw this during the pandemic. So many people define themselves based on their work at, say, a company like Google. And then when Google lays off 10% of their employees, they lose their identity. And then I think the other way in which it's risky is that it creates these sky-high expectations. So if your work is your sole means of self-actualization, that's a really high bar to set. That creates a lot of room for disappointment underneath it. And so if you think about your work as part of, but not the entirety of who you are, I think it is a much more healthy way to approach not just your work life, but your life more broadly.
I like neither is more noble, specifically because as somebody who's been curating on the future of works for a decade now, I hear a lot of one side or the other.
Mm,
And the thing about responsive, even as a manifesto, that I really appreciate is it's not prescriptive. It's not saying don't work hard, right? You're not saying don't work hard. You're also saying, don't, exclusively, whatever, 4 day work week. It depends on what your goals are. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. Um, Certainly, is there utility to rest? Like, obviously, no one is going to argue, don't sleep and work instead, but not anymore. That was maybe an argument people were making 10 years ago,
mm,
right? You can sleep when you're dead. But the I have a friend, Justin, in LA, who writes a newsletter called Just Go Grind for entrepreneurs. And it's also true that to build something big, to build something substantial, to just build my own business, there are times when I do have to just go grind, when I do have to really work. And it's not that one or the other is a better course, but that each person needs to plot their own is something that I hear you saying across your work, and that everyone figuring out their own boundaries is actually the goal.
totally. Yeah, I think in our society there is this inclination to either villainize or lionize work. To either say, I'm anti-work, work is a necessary evil, let's burn it all down, or to say, the only way to do good work is to always be doing what you love. Work is the only vehicle through which you can make an impact in the world. And my attempt with a good enough job is to find that middle path. It's not a slacker manifesto. It is not hustle porn. It's the idea that we work more than we do just about anything else, and how we spend those hours matters, and that we are all more than what we do for work. And so it's incumbent on each of us to invest in other parts of who we are. I like what you said about, especially for entrepreneurs. I think, there's balance in terms of our identities. There's balance in terms of some people do what they love, others do what they have to. But I think there's also a more temporal balance, which is a natural seasonality to work. And so, if it's the end of a quarter and you have a sales quota, maybe you need to just go grind. Or if you're trying to get something off the ground, maybe you're putting in longer days. But hopefully you recognize that that is one season of your life, and you don't burn the candle at both ends until the point that you realize that there's nothing left.
Falling over. Yep. I'd love to talk a little bit about your writing process, having written and published one and written and soon to be published a second. I mean, even all the way back to poetry, to journalism, to publishing books. Um, Maybe let's start actually forward looking though. What is the role of books in 2025 and going forward, right? In this
Mm.
world that is changing as quickly as it is, with technology able to summarize information as quickly as AI and LLMs can. What's the utility of books? And I say that as somebody who has several hundred books here to my left.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I wish I did. I'm in a bunch of group chats with authors, and there's a lot of existential angst right now about the future, specifically of nonfiction writing. Um, I think about a few things. One is I think personal storytelling will grow in importance. If you're just telling sort of factual information, that's the type of things that LLMs can reproduce in an instant. But for me, for example, all of my writing is based around profiles, so based around character studies that requires reporting for me to go out into the field and spend time with people. And so I don't know how long that will be a hedge or a moat for me, but that is something that I'll lean into. I think that regardless of books' sort of utility as a way of conveying information, they serve other roles as well. I think there is a form of entertainment. There's a form of a book as an object, as a physical thing. There's some Japanese word about just or maybe German word, I don't know, one of these sort of multisyllabic words that's untranslatable about the value in just being surrounded by books, regardless of whether or not you're reading them. Maybe they'll go the way of the vinyl record where they become a more sort of niche collector's item. But books are, society's way of holding our most well thought out information. I think that they're not going to become obsolete. Maybe the form will change in terms of people's process of how they write them. Maybe there will be things like guarantees of what is written by a human and what is written by an algorithm, or there'll be sort of the centaur chess approach where all of the writers of the future will be able to skillfully adopt these new technologies. But I think you can appreciate when something has a level of human touch, especially in an increasingly tech powered world. Um, and note that feels like it's handwritten is different from a note that is handwritten. And so that's sort of some musings, but I also don't claim to have any knowledge of whether my career will still be in existence in the next 5 years, which I think is part of why I picked this topic for my second book. It's a lot of great uncertainties that we face right now.
Our mutual friend and recently published author Brie Groff wants published by like created by human stickers, like an organic sticker on vegetables, but instead it's created by human. It's just like something that can exist. And I think that we will see that in the next few decades, or even the next 2 years.
Yeah, I think we all
Tell
have like our moment of like AI awakening, and mine happened relatively recently, which is I wrote an op-ed, and it was like on a Friday. I turned in the final draft to my editor at the Times, and I was off to go to a bachelor party, and I thought I was all done. And in the Uber on the way to the airport, I get an email from my editor, and she says, "It all looks great, except there's this one metaphor that isn't quite working for me." And then I went to ChatGPT and I said, "Can I have 10 metaphors that are similar to this metaphor, but a little bit different?" And this might be outing myself now. But anyways, I picked one of the metaphors, I inserted it into the piece, and the next day it was printed in the New York Times. And maybe I've, broken some either explicit or implicit law about the ethics of journalism. But that was the first time that I was like, whoa, like this shit is crazy. And it's not just like the purely factual like way of communicating. It is like a metaphor that I think is actually quite beautiful. So who knows where we go from here?
Yeah, we've been curating on AI at Responsive Conference since 2019, and yet my AI awakening moment, and I mean, we had people on stage last year in September of 2024, the head of people at Asana, uh, Anna Binder, and AJ Thomas, who was the head of talent at X the Moonshot Factory, just like pleading with the audience to like practice with LLMs, practice with AI engines, an hour a day, just like spend the time. So this has been a topic that I've been curating on at Responsive for a long time now. And yet my AI awakening moment came this spring when my partner and I were buying our first house,
Mm.
because the rate of my learning in real estate and in a world that is fairly bureaucratic and very, very legalese and documentation and like unclear, right? There's this false sense of urgency more often than not. There's a um, hyper intensity. And it's also one of the bigger purchases most people will ever make in their lifetimes is buying a house, especially in California. But my rate of learning amidst that, because I could feed information into ChatGPT and do, for example, deep research on, okay, we just saw a house that had a redwood tree in the front yard that was cut down some indeterminate time in the past. What is the impact of those redwood tree roots on the foundation of this house,
Mm.
given these potential realities, right? And the amount of information I could get back was so abundant and so much more deep than I could get by calling arborists, for example, or talking to a real estate agent, created for me this holy shit experience, that even while, in this case, real estate was slow moving because of human bureaucracies and the difficulties of building in the state of California, the rate of learning that I was able to create because of these tools was 10 to 100 times faster than what I could have done previously.
Yeah, it's a very profound moment, the oh shit moment, and I think more and more people are having it every day.
What let's go into, I'll come back to your writing, but since we're talking about uncertainty as relates to AI, Tell me a little bit, tell us a little bit about the upcoming book and the focus on uncertainty in general.
Yeah, so the book is called How to Not Know. And the broad argument is that we are in a time that is, at least feels, increasingly uncertain. It's this sort of polycrisis of economic instability and political uncertainty, planetary uncertainty, personal uncertainty in the daily decisions that we make in our lives. And yet our tolerance for uncertainty is only decreasing. We feel, because of technology, because of the internet, because of this expectation that we have that answers should be readily available, increasingly uncomfortable with the uncertainty that we face. And so the book is an attempt to help people get better at dealing with what they don't know. The title is a little bit tongue in cheek, right? It's a how-to book about how to not know. But in each chapter, I follow the story of someone dealing with uncertainty in their life. So there's a couple deciding whether or not they want to get divorced. There's a country that is reckoning with the existential threat of climate change. There is someone who is deciding whether or not they want to leave a cult that has become the primary source of community and identity in their lives. And through each of these chapters, hopefully I convey some insight into how you might be able to get better at dealing with uncertainty. One of the sort of organizing principles of the book is around what I call the three horsemen of delusion, which are three psychological biases or tendencies that we have that get in the way of our ability to admit what we don't know. And so the first is comfort, how feeling certain can give us a sense of comfort, even if certainty is not actually factual. The second is hubris, our tendency to have excessive pride and think that we know more than we do. And the third is control, and how certainty can give us a sense of control over the future, even when it's illusory. And so I sort of break down each of these tendencies, and then by the end, hopefully give you some tools to get better at dealing with what you don't know in your life.
I'm going to come back to uncertainty and jump back to writing now because I'm so curious. I really share your opinion and belief that in the utility of books, the role of investigative journalism is going to be more important. The utility of personal narrative, right? Nobody can tell the story of starting a cafe with no experience and selling it on Craigslist 3 years later, but me having lived through that experience, and that is I meet a lot of people who want to open up a cafe, and I can tell that story very personally in a way that AI could never replicate, at
Mm.
least not that I've seen. What is your process for finding these stories, right? Finding a country that is struggling with climate crisis, and then how they're adapting to that. Like, how do you choose those stories? How do you investigate those stories? Where do you go to find them? And then what is your process for writing about them?
Yeah, well, I think the first question is like, why stories? And I think that's why I got into writing. It wasn't to necessarily hold powerful people to account or to be able to interview famous CEOs. It was to find gripping, compelling, engaging stories. And in my favorite nonfiction writing, it is story based. And so that's sort of why I've taken this approach in both of my first and second books to focus on profiles. I think the most essential component of a good story is you need change. So change in someone's plot and change in someone's cognitive or psychological development. And so that's what I'm always looking for is where does someone begin and where does someone end, and how can a story help show that process of transformation? And then there are different sort of themes that I was hoping to cover in the book. So the book goes from sort of the most personal, so things like self doubt, to interpersonal, how do you make decisions with someone else, to organizational, how do you hold room for dissent and uncertainty within a company, to existential, how do you deal with things like our mortality or the fact that the climate crisis is getting increasingly urgent. And so It's a bit of top down and bottom up. Some of it is reaching out to my network and asking if there's anyone else I should talk to and doing a lot of those sort of early initial screening calls. Some of it is proactively going to find people that I think would be compelling to talk about. So, for example, there's a chapter about someone with OCD, which is called the doubting disease or the doubting disorder. And I wanted to look at OCD kind of clinically and tell us what we could learn from someone with OCD, even if we don't have the disorder. And then there were things that I just had to learn on the ground. So the country I mentioned is this country called Tuvalu, which is in the Pacific. And the average height of the country, the average sort of altitude, is 10 feet above sea level. And, it's this island nation, atoll nation, somewhere between Hawaii and Australia. And the estimate is that by 2050, half of the country will be flooded by tidal waters. And so it's, climate change is literally like lapping up on the shores of this country. And so I went and I spent 2 weeks there, and that's sort of the on the ground reporting that I don't think can be as replicated by AI. And last point I'll make is something that I learned from one of my very first editors, who told me that the story you find is always better than the story you seek. And
Hmm.
so I think part of my role as a journalist is to go to these interesting places, to meet these interesting people, and not presume what the story is going to be, but actually listening for the story that I find once I get there. And so that's sort of my approach when it comes to personal storytelling.
Nice. What advice would you give to aspiring writers? I published 2 books, self-published, on Amazon in 2012 on how to do a handstand, in 2017, sort of a profile of people practicing responsive organizational practices. Um, Plan to write more, plan to publish more. But for anybody listening, entrepreneurs, creatives, writers, what do you think about books and writing and publishing books going forward?
I answered in kind of an orthogonal way, which is, so in addition to an author, I'm a freelance reporter, freelance journalist. And when I'm pitching stories, there are always 4 questions that I ask myself. Those 4 questions are: what's the story? Why should people care? Why is now the time to write it? And why are you the person to write it? And I think those last 2 are the ones that often get neglected. I think in general, people have a good sense of stories and what makes a story interesting. And I think the things that make a story urgent are when it is connected to something that is relevant to people's lives for one reason or another right now at this moment, and when it is a story that only you can tell. And so my advice to aspiring writers is, one is think about what are the stories that only you could tell. As you mentioned, only you could tell a story about buying a cafe and selling it on Craigslist 3 years later. And then the other advice is not very interesting, but I think it bears repeating, which is the only way to get better at writing is to write. You can read books about writing, you can listen to podcasts about writers, but writing is a craft and writing is a practice. And so if you want to take your writing life seriously, you have to find means of accountability to make sure that you write, whether it's putting time on your calendar or finding a writing group or a writing buddy, giving yourself a deadline, publicly declaring that you're going to share things, whatever it takes to get you to actually put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard or, I don't know, voice to voice note. You need to find those methods of accountability and really try and create a practice around it, because, writing, I forget who said this, but writing is the act of putting your ass in the chair. Writing is the
Sounds like
actual
Stephen Pressfield.
doing of the writing. And so I think we can dress it up in a million different ways, but at the most fundamental level, that's the best piece of writing advice you could get.
Or Ernest Hemingway. I'm not sure. It feels like it could be either of those two. Um, I'm really glad you went with the title How to Not Know. When we were first getting to know each other, you were trying to decide between a couple of book titles, and
Mm.
I like the wink of How to Not Know. I like the little humor, the little play of it, and the play of it's a how-to book with an unknown impact. What in your life has changed since doing that research, or what are you struggling with when it comes to certainty? we don't know each other well, but you've always struck me as pretty even keeled. So particularly I'm interested in the like, what do you struggle with when it comes to uncertainty? And thus then how are you applying what you've been researching in the book?
Yeah, great question. I'll talk about what changed for me in the reporting of my first book, and I think it's similar, which is coming into writing the Good Enough Job. I think I had a little bit more of a hot take. I was like, we live in a work-centric world, and it's breaking things down. And I think over the course of spending, 2 or 3 years reporting on it, it tempered into something a little bit more lukewarm. This idea that, work is important, but it's not the only thing that's important. And I think something similar is happening in the reporting of this book on uncertainty. Fundamentally, it's a book about the virtue, the value of uncertainty. And one of the things that I'm learning through the process of reporting it and spending time talking to researchers and psychologists and neuroscience is that, uncertainty is uncomfortable by design. The value of uncertainty is that it is uncomfortable, because when something is uncomfortable, you pay attention to it. Think about sort of like a, prehistoric human reaching for a berry. And if you haven't seen the berry before, you might proceed with a little bit more caution, which is an adaptive trait. And so I think initially I was, making the case for uncertainty. And there's this John Steinbeck quote that I love, which is, I was born lost and take no pleasure in being found. And so as someone who felt very comfortable with ambiguity, comfortable with uncertainty, I wanted to go out and say, lean into uncertainty, embrace uncertainty. And I think one of the things that's changed is I'm learning about the value of certainty. I think they're both fundamental drives that we need. And for example, the fact that you are buying a house so that you're in a committed relationship might allow you to hold more uncertainty in other facets of your life. I think certainty begets the ability to become more comfortable with uncertainty. And so it's not sort of a either or thing. It's more of a toggle and a wobble. And I think that's something that I've come to appreciate more in myself. And so, for example, like Simo, the 22-year-old, loved traveling to places with no itinerary and sort of going by the seat of my pants and asking the person at the front desk of the hostel where I should go next and saying yes to it. And there's value in spontaneity like that. There's value in really leading into uncertainty. But I think we all know people who treat embracing uncertainty as an excuse to not commit and sort of live perpetually in this liminal space where you don't get depth because you're just so addicted to novelty or uncertainty. And so I think that's one thing that's sort of changed in my thinking.
I'm a native Californian, as are you. Like I take it for granted that I have an emergency kit nearby me in my car, in my house, right? Like, of course I have water for earthquakes, not in a fear-based way, but just in a like, that's just practical because I don't assume that we're not going to run out of toilet paper for a future pandemic or that, water might not be shut off if there's a major earthquake in the next 15 minutes. And it's not a fear factor. It's just kind of, I take it for granted. When it comes to the unpredictability that we're experiencing in the world today and the increasing likelihood that work is going to be less stable, that our lives are going to be less stable going forward in the next decade, I think a lot about durable skills. What are the skills? What are the meta skills that I can be practicing or that I can encourage my, I don't have kids yet, but future kids to practice in the hopes that those will help them stay resilient and more adaptable to change? What are the durable skills that are most interesting, most applicable to you, or maybe even that you would teach to, being a new father, teach to your kid as they grow up?
Yeah, I think, the most durable skill is the ability to learn. It's a bit of a cop-out answer, but in a world that is rapidly changing, not having the arrogance or the hubris to presume that you know exactly what you'll need in the future, but investing in your ability to have that growth mindset, the ability to learn new things. I think the ability to be an engaging storyteller is always going to be a derivative skill, whether or not it can be monetized, but we will all always sit around the proverbial fire and need to entertain each other. And I think an increasingly important skill is being able to separate what we can control from what we can't control. And so I like to think about this sort of decision tree, which is, you're faced with an uncertain situation. The first question is, what about this situation can I control or can I influence? And if you can do something that influences the outcome, do that. And if not, then you get into these sort of like sub branches of the decision tree. And one is, can you prepare for different possible outcomes? Can you build your proverbial go bag? Can you ask yourself, okay, if this cancer test does come back positive, do I know how I'll pay for it? Do I know how my kid will get to school on Monday if I have to go into the hospital? And then from there might be things that you can't control. And then it comes to, acceptance and being able to regulate your own emotions. So there's one study that I'm thinking about in particular, which is this researcher went and interviewed a bunch of breast cancer patients. And she found that the hardest part of the entire breast cancer journey for the majority of her subjects was the period between when they went in for a biopsy and when they got their results. More than the chemo, more than any surgery, it was having to sit with the not knowing. And I think that's, a really insightful lesson to learn, which is often we are more uncomfortable with uncertainty than we are with a certain bad outcome. Like there's this other study about people who received a certain electric shock, so they knew they were going to get an electric shock, and people who had a 50% chance of receiving an electric shock. And those with a 50% chance were way more stressed out than the people that knew they were about to get shocked.
And develop learned helplessness, or are much more likely to learn to just not even explore how to get out, right? The dog's getting electric shocks that then the door is open and they can leave, but they've learned that they can't leave, and so they don't try to.
Totally.
Right.
And so I think that's a really important skill in the future, is to be able to separate what you can control from what you can't control, and not invest too much of your energy into things that you can't control, and learn how to hopefully make a difference in the ways that you can influence your future.
Nice. Having had an AI awakening moment this year in your writing, what role does AI play in your work today, and how are you using it to sort of explore what's possible or your relationship to it?
Yeah, it's changed a lot recently. If you asked me this maybe 3 weeks ago, I would have said I use ChatGPT as a glorified thesaurus, and sometimes I replace Google with ChatGPT. And now I have a much more sort of intentional relationship with AI in my editing process. And so I write all of my first drafts on my own. I don't really use AI as a brainstorming tool, but I use it as sort of a sparring partner when it comes to refining my work. And so sometimes I'll copy and paste something that I've written into AI and say, how can this be improved? And there's something I've learned from having received feedback from a lot of amateur editors over the course of my journalism career, friends and others who just want to read the work, which is that people are often right about something being wrong, but they're not often right about the solution. So I have sort of treated AI similarly, where, if it diagnoses that this section is dragging, it's probably dragging, but I am not going to copy and paste their desired implementation for a solution. I will try and do that work myself. And, I think like any creative, part of the joy is through the toil. And so I hope it doesn't replace all of the friction. I think friction is what creates heat, what creates energy. And part of what makes the process of having written so rewarding is the, trying to rewrite a sentence 20 different times and then deleting the sentence, and that's your day, and that's part of the joy of being a craftsperson, a joy of being a writer. But I consider myself a novice AI practitioner that is hopefully going to keep learning and finding ways that it works with my workflow moving forward.
I'm pretty relentlessly optimistic in my life. It's maybe of necessity. There's enough depression in my extended family that I've just learned to force myself to default to an optimistic worldview. And I remain fairly pessimistic about where the world is going politically when it comes to AI taking jobs, particularly entry-level jobs, to sort of the the rate of change that we continue to experience, right? Things went so fast. We were talking about remote distributed work at Responsive Conference 2016, and then COVID happened, right? Like Lyft and Uber took over ride sharing, took over taxis, and now Waymo is taking over that business. When I look at the future, one of my practices for resilience, practices for embracing uncertainty is to look for the positive outcomes, because it's really easy to hear and to see the negative outcomes. I'm wondering, maybe as we wrap here, on a positive note, what are you hopeful about for the future?
Yeah, I'll be the annoying person that says, like, I disagree with the premise of the question. I mean, I think it's a good question. But
Great.
first I'll tell you a little a parable that you may have heard before that has helped my thinking about emerging technologies. It's called the parable of the Chinese farmer. And it goes something like this. There's this farmer in rural China, and one day his horse runs away. And all of his neighbors come to his door and say, "Oh, we're so sorry. How unfortunate that your horse has run away." And the farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." And the next day, the horse comes back, and there's 6 other horses with it. The horses made friends. And now this farmer has a fleet of horses, and his neighbors come to his door and say, "Oh, what luck. You have all these new horses. What great fortune has come upon you." And the farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." And the next day, his son takes out one of the wild horses to go for a ride and falls and breaks his leg. And he gets brought back to the town, and the neighbors say, "Oh, what bad luck. You've fallen and broken your leg, you know." And the farmer goes, "As you might expect, maybe yes, maybe no." And the day after that, the general from the Chinese army comes to conscript people into the war. And because his son has broken his leg, he can avoid the draft. And again, the neighbors say, "How lucky you are." And the farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." But I think that's sort of my general approach to AI, to uncertainty, to the way the world is going is, you know, as a journalist, as someone who speaks, I think there is a lot of clout in people who can accurately predict the future or claim certainty about where we're headed. And the truth is, I really don't know. Maybe AI will cause this huge civil unrest, or maybe there will be all of these jobs that we can't even think about today that will come online in the future. Maybe we'll be ushered into an age of riches, a new golden age, buttressed by universal basic income. And maybe we will have this increased disparity between the haves and the have-nots. If I were to put my finger on one thing that I'm optimistic about, is I think the value of human touch, as we mentioned at the beginning of this call, is going to increase. Things that are made with love, where you could really tell someone goes above and beyond, or takes an inconvenient route, or the friend that gives you a ride to the airport, even though the self-driving car is cheap and readily available. I think a newfound appreciation for things that aren't automated or aren't hyper efficient might be a positive externality of this age that we're entering. But maybe yes, maybe no.
That's a great place to end. Simone, where can folks go to learn more about you and follow along with your work?
Yeah, there's sort of 2 places. One is my website, which is thegoodenough.job.com. You can find me and all my socials there. And then the second is I run a newsletter called the Article Book Club. It's a book club, but for articles. So every month I send out an article or 2 that I think is worth reading, not written by me. And it's a fun way to sort of stay in touch passively. There's a few thousand people that are part of the club at this point.
Awesome. And I'd be remiss if I didn't shout out that you're going to be opening on stage at Responsive Conference 2025, September 17th and 18th. And I'm so excited to host you on stage and appreciate you coming to our little conference and sharing your research and your work.